I'm not sure if you heard, but we're hosting a financial retreat in Medellin, Colombia, and Bali, Indonesia in 2023. If you want to learn more, you can just go to worth-winning.com. Welcome to the Worth Listening podcast, where we focus on having positive and productive conversations around money. I'm your host, Lauryn, a 4-time Olympian and certified financial planner. On this show, my guests share their money stories. Everyone has a unique story and experiences both wins and losses when it comes to money. My intent is to give listeners something they can relate to, something that builds their courage to be open and take control of their own money story. When I'm not creating a great show for my listeners, I'm running my company, Worth Winning, where I help individuals and families organize their finances. Check us out at worth-winning.com. All right, now on with the show. Welcome to June and welcome back to Money Memoirs. So if you are new to the show, we love letting people share their money story. I think that the best way to learn is from others' experience, and each of us has our own unique perspective, but there's also commonalities that prevent us from feeling alone on our financial journey. So while we're all unique, we also have a lot of things in common. And if you haven't listened to any of the money memoirs of the past, you should go back because there's lots of cool ones. People just sharing their money story. And today will be no different. So after a brief hiatus from Money Memoirs, I am excited to be jumping back in with my guest, Sean Johnson Sippial. So Sean found Bitcoin back in 2016 and has not looked back. We're going to talk about when Bitcoin became a thing, because if you don't know where Bitcoin became a thing, you'll know that that's pretty early on in Bitcoin's journey. Sean is a self-proclaimed Bitcoin evangelist, and he is going to share his money memoir with us today. So without further ado, let's listen. Sean, I just told everybody a little bit about you, how I came to know you, and what we're going to talk about today on this episode. But I think it's important that we let the people introduce themselves, and you are the people. So why don't we start with you just kind of telling us a little bit about where you're from, how you got started, and just a little bit about you so the audience knows who you are.
My name is Sean. I am originally from Alabama. I now live in Texas.
Yeah. What did your parents do? Did you have any siblings? What was your life like growing up?
Now I have 3 siblings. Growing up, I had 2. So my mom and my dad weren't together, but I have 2 brothers on my dad's side and a younger brother now that is 8. But otherwise, growing up, my dad for a while worked for my grandfather, and my mom kind of did different jobs. She was a massage therapist, had her own business at one point. And then she got into real estate, and both of my parents now work in real estate and have the broker's license in Alabama.
It sounds like it is a really fun upbringing that you had. You got 3 siblings, your parents being employed by your grandparents. I'm sure it was like kind of keeping it all in the family. So what was it kind of like from a money standpoint, childhood wise? Because I'm sure there's some interactions that had to happen with your parents being employed by your grandparents, and then how you were experiencing growing up in the midst of that. What stands out to you about your childhood memories of money?
So I guess clarifying, my father was employed by my grandfather, but my mom wasn't. But yeah, I guess around money, my mom, like I said, had her own business at a point in time, a massage business. And then my grandfather had different businesses over time, my paternal grandfather. So yeah, I would kind of say my relationship to money has been more like in the sense of relationship to entrepreneurship than per se like getting a lot of direct lessons about money growing up, but yeah, kind of just more seeing in ways in which people in my life were making money. And for me, like I always was the type of kid where I would save my money and then make big purchases versus like kind of spending money on small things. And I had like the first job I ever had, I guess outside of like just working, maybe like cutting grass or something like that for family members. I was like 12, I want to say, when I started working on the weekends, sweeping up hair at a local barbershop. Heritage Barbershop in Montgomery. Shout out to Boo Man, owner of Heritage, to, let me sweep up the hair. And I used to make $50 every Saturday that I would go there and sweep. So I would say like my relationship to money just growing up is I wasn't really super money hungry, but at the same time, I kind of understood that money will buy you things that you want. So I definitely would try to make it and save it for bigger ticket items, like at least for a kid, right? Like whether that be like video games or just kind of things like that that I could buy on my own with the money I'd earned.
I would say $50 as a kid in one day was a pretty large amount of money. So you sound like you're making a pretty good living at that first job. Were you only working on Saturdays though? So it's only once a week that you had the opportunity to make that much money.
Yeah, it's only once a week. And actually before that, my first experience in entrepreneurship was I used to sell candy at school. It was like fourth grade. I don't know what gave me the idea, but I just basically bought some candy from the dollar store, took it to school and started making some money. And eventually I made a little bit too much money and the school shut me down. Like I guess I was competing. They would sell snacks too and candy. And I guess I was making too much money competing with them. So they told me I had to stop selling candy, which for me kind of feel like it's a counter lesson to teach a child. But I understand, I guess, like I was cutting into their dealings. But yeah, like $50, yeah, it's definitely a lot. And just the fact that I kind of had a sense of independence. My mom would drop me off. Then I'd be at the barbershop all day. Sometimes I'd be the only kid in there. Got to make $50. Said it was only once a week on Saturdays. I definitely really enjoyed that and look back on those times fondly.
All right. So entrepreneurship sounds like you said it was a common theme through your childhood. Your grandfather was an entrepreneur. Your father worked for the family business. And so you picked up entrepreneurship somewhere along the way. You said as early as fourth grade by starting selling candy at the school, which it's interesting because that's also a story that I have. So it's funny to see how it manifests itself in people's lives later on when they start kind of entrepreneurship at early age like that. So you're selling the candy, they shut your business down. You're a little bit upset about it, but it doesn't stop you. So they shut your business down, entrepreneurship thwarted for a minute. You go on to the barbershop. You had to go get your, kind of quote unquote W-2 job, if you will, even though it wasn't probably W-2 way back then. It was just a little cash under the table. Did you find your way back to entrepreneurship as a child at some point before becoming a grown-up?
To be honest, probably just little things here and there. Like I didn't really sell candy. Maybe sold some burnt CDs or something like that from here and there. But I wouldn't say it was probably more like I got summer jobs after high school. So not in the same way.
Gotcha. You also mentioned having some brothers and that you were a saver. You said you would save up for kind of big ticket items. Big ticket when you're a kid is definitely video games. Those were pretty expensive. Do you have recollection of your brothers being also savers, or were you the saver and they were the spender? Were you kind of giving them tips on how to save their money back when you all were kids?
So I'm 4.5 and 6.5 years older than the brothers I grew up with. And then our youngest brother, I am 22 years older than him. So I didn't grow up with him. He didn't grow up with us, or at least with me, I should say. I didn't live with them all the time, but yeah, we definitely had piggy banks and they would save up their money in the piggy banks and whatnot. So to be honest with you though, when it comes to money with my little brothers and I, we used to always gamble. We would always just bet on video games or different things like that. So sometimes they would win money from me, I would win money from them. But yeah, that probably is the biggest theme when it comes to money between my little brothers and I, when we were younger, is just competing and putting some money where our mouth is type stuff.
Are you all still gambling today and placing bets?
Not as much really, and that's kind of the thing. I'm the type of person I'll bet just to show my confidence, but I'm not a gambler. I don't really care for casino. I'm kind of tight when it comes to losing money in that way. So once I hit $50 at casino, I'm feeling like I made a bad decision. So I'm not a huge gambler in that regard. But yeah, I'm still my little brothers and I don't really, we all live in different places now, so we don't really have as much time around each other to do bets like that. Because most of the time it was just in person messing around. It's not off the table, right? We get together and put the right game on, and yeah, it's not off the table. Or play a little dice. It's whatever. We can get to it if we have to, but we haven't I don't remember last time we put some money on something, to be honest with you.
Fair enough. I think it also speaks to risk tolerance. You mentioned $50 is the most you're willing to lose when you're in some sort of gambling situation. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of your investment views and things shortly, but let's wrap up kind of childhood life. And it sounds like you had a really fun time. You learned a lot of life lessons and money lessons during childhood, but we get to the high school age and everybody generally goes from kindergarten to 12th grade. And then it's kind of like there's varying paths that people take from that point going forward. What was your plan after high school? Was college something that was talked about in your household? Were you interested in going to the military? What were you thinking? What did you know or understand about like financial responsibility when you were high school aged?
I guess the path I took was college. Growing up, that was the path that was largely held up as an example path. So out of high school, I went to college, and I didn't necessarily have like a strong sense of financial responsibility, more than the fact that I've always just kind of been miserly in the sense that I'm looking back, I am and have been for a while. I'm more like motivated to keep money sometimes than I have been to make money, which has benefits and drawbacks. But yeah, I wouldn't say like I necessarily was focused on financial responsibility as a high school student.
You mentioned you've always been really focused on keeping money versus spending the money. Where do you think that focus came from for you?
For me, it's probably just like coming back to what money buys you, right? Like money's a tool at the end of the day. Maybe just from a young age, like just without putting the words on it, was more of a person to spend on experiences. I think it's kind of just the fact that I would save my money, and then like I would have money to buy something I wanted that might cost more than having money and spending it on chips every day, right? Like you have $50 and spend it on 50 bags of chips, or $50 and spend it on a video game, right? And like for me, as a kid, I would be the kid to spend on a video game versus the chips. At the end of the day, foregoing some smaller desires, satisfy larger desires, maybe, is where it came from. Like I never really inherently called it out. It was just behavior I just more innately showed.
Fair enough. You were born with like just a deep sense for delayed gratification being a good thing. It sounds like.
At least around money, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So what did you major in school, and what were you thinking was going to happen kind of life after college?
So I'm kind of the type where, I never grew up wanting to be something specific my whole life. Like, there were spurts or periods of time, I should say, where, it's just like, maybe I wanted to be in the NBA or something, right? Just little kid aspirations that are kind of fleeting, right? But I never like grew up the majority of my life being like, I want to be a veterinarian, or I want to do this. And like, that was my path into, I guess, my decisions as a young adult into being an adult. So for me, I majored in management information systems at the University of Alabama. And that's essentially, at least at Alabama, a blend between IT and business. So it's in the business college at Alabama, but you learn some programming and you learn, just kind of different IT, I guess, facets. And I found that major. I'm a people person. I like working in teams. So whenever they presented, they kind of like large picture or big picture, kind of gave an image of a team-based program, where you're in the business college, but you're also learning about technology essentially at a high level. And growing up, I was always the type of kid that was attracted to little like gadgets and stuff like that. Like, so kind of, analytical mind. Even though growing up, I really preferred watching TV over the computer, I still like different like tech gadgets and stuff like that. So pretty much from orientation, I decided on the major, and it was something I ended up enjoying the major. And after school, I got a job as a travel consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is like a big accounting firm that, has offices all over the world. But I didn't really care for that.
So how did you get that job right after school? Because that was not directly related to your major. I think so often a college kid might be listening to this and they think like, oh my God, I have to pick the exact right major. I have to know what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And the reality is most of us don't actually know. And sometimes we're doing something that's completely outside of our major. So it sounds like your first job was outside of your major. But how did you find that job? And then, like you said, what were the things you didn't like about it that made you maybe want to switch to something different?
So with PwC, I guess there was a consulting practice. I wasn't doing accounting. It's like that's generally the main business line or business offering at PwC. But within the consulting practice, that kind of was actually kind of aligned. And PwC, with my program, they used to have companies present to us like once a month, I want to say. And all the big four accounting / consulting firms came and presented. So I was familiar with PwC, but how I actually got the job was there was a program through our career center at Alabama. You could go online, you submit your resume, any companies that are interested that you match with and match with you, you could set up an interview. So I did that, and then PwC was on campus, I guess, doing interviews or something related to my program, I want to say. Or they were on campus and my program set up like a meet and greet the day before they were doing interviews, something along those lines. And kind of just talked to the recruiter. And like the night before, we kind of hit it off. So then once we got into the interviews, it was kind of smooth sailing. I got the internship after my junior year, going into my senior year. And I interned in New York City. I was working there for like 2.5 months. And then at the end of the internship, the team I worked with recommended me for a full-time position. And from like October of that year, they made an offer and I ended up accepting it. So like pretty much the first semester of my senior year was my last year of college. I did 4 years. I am already signed a job offer. So pretty much like from October till May, I knew I already had a job locked in, and I was just basically just had to finish school.
That's pretty awesome to be junior in college. They said, take advantage of this opportunity and then get an offer extended to you before you're actually finished with college during your senior year. So it's like, okay, I already know, like I'm doing the steps. I finished high school. I'm going to finish college. I got to go get a job. I already got the job. Things are kind of plugging along, but sounds like it kind of took a left turn somewhere in the sense that you got that job, but that wasn't the thing that was for you. So, maybe why wasn't it the thing that necessarily was interesting? And then what did you pivot to next?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that it sounds good on paper, right? Like travel consulting, you get to travel for work and, you get to go to all these different places potentially. But in practice, it just wasn't what I expected. And ultimately, I just didn't care for it. So I would say for me, I would travel Monday through Thursday, most days, sometimes Sunday through Thursday. So I had just moved to Houston, maybe like a couple months before I started traveling. So I didn't really have a lot of time to get familiar with the new city I just moved to. I lived in Alabama up until 22, spent about 5 months in China, and then moved to Houston. So I didn't really have a lot of time to get familiar with the city. Then I'm traveling Monday to Thursday. So I'm like splitting time between two places I'm not super familiar with. And then job-wise, too, it was just like long hours sometimes. And work really wasn't interesting to me. And also, like, I feel like the main thing that really kind of solidified it for me is just like I would look at some of the people I was working with, like the people in higher positions, and the stress they were under and their general health. I just didn't really see myself wanting to be like them. I didn't want to emulate them. And for me, it's just like if my path leads to their position, and I'm looking at people and like pretty much nobody I'm working with on a senior management level, I want to emulate the life that I see them leading, which is outside looking in, but essentially I'm working with them and, kind of got to the point where I really wasn't interested in it very much. And kind of around the same time that I started my job, I also started falling really deeply into learning about Bitcoin. So my interest was taken away from my job by something that I've since become much more passionate about. And I didn't really see my path.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a very mature perspective at that age. Like you said, one thing you did skip, you slid it in there on us. I think other people probably heard it too. It's like, oh, and I lived in China for 5 months. So it's like, we went from college to PwC, but sounds like something cool happened in that China phase. So we'll come back to that in a second. But, we're at PwC. You're saying like, I don't feel like this is a good long-term fit for me. I value work-life balance, which is something that we're all talking about now. It wasn't really being phrased like that probably back at the time that you were working that job. But like you said, you didn't want to emulate what you were seeing. And it's like, okay, this isn't the thing. What else am I interested in? And it sounds like you found Bitcoin as an interest. So, tell us a little bit about that, because that's a very popular topic nowadays. How did you kind of stumble across Bitcoin? And is that kind of what you transitioned out of PwC to be able to do instead?
Yeah, so I probably first heard about Bitcoin while at the University of Alabama. Like I can't really pinpoint the exact time, but it would have probably been anywhere between 2011 and 2013, I would say. That I had like some friends that were involved in Bitcoin, and probably at the time their involvement might have been related to Silk Road, which was, like an online marketplace that you could pretty much buy a number of different things. And Basically, it was using Bitcoin as like the payment rails. So I heard about it then, but at the time it was just like, I feel like what a lot of people reaction to when they first hear Bitcoin is just, you really don't understand like what it is or why it is. So I was like, okay, like internet money, I'm like, I don't really know what that is, and like I don't really know why you're using it, but okay, like, and I just didn't really give it much thought. So then this is kind of where I guess Bitcoin and my China story collide. So I spent time in China out of school. So before I signed my offer for PwC, I asked for two things. So originally they offered me the job in New York City, and just being from the South, I just didn't want to deal with the cold. Like when I was in New York City, I worked in Midtown, not far from Times Square, and I lived in Harlem. And I didn't really care for the Times Square area very much, but I definitely enjoyed living in Harlem. But, I was there for the summertime. So the climate, more or less, I was used to. It was hot, but, I'm used to that being from Alabama. But I was not ready to deal with the cold. So I asked to be moved to Houston. And then the second thing I asked was to take a gap year. So I basically to start a year later than my start date would have been coming out of college. And PwC granted both of those for me whenever I came out. So graduating college, like I graduated, and then maybe within like 2 or 3 weeks, one of my Chinese teachers in college, because I took Chinese in college, reached out to me about a program. Long story short, like I went through the program and got placed in China to teach for a period. And while I was in China, sometimes I would just be sitting in my apartment with just the internet. And I don't know what made me think about Bitcoin, but something made me think about Bitcoin. The way Bitcoin was presented to the world was through what's called a white paper, which is essentially kind of like a presentation of an idea in the form of like an essay, almost. And I read the Bitcoin white paper, and I don't know why I was primed at that point in time to receive the information in the white paper, but like it just in that moment, ideologically, it clicked. I didn't really understand everything I was reading, but just from a big picture perspective, ideologically, I was aligned with what was being said in Bitcoin. And essentially that was either late 2015, early 2016. So I was in China from September 2015 until March 2016. And then I started my job with PwC in August of 2016. So yeah, pretty much when I came back to the U.S., I had some time between when I started or when I was supposed to start my job when I got back. So I just got a serving job, and I first started buying a little Bitcoin. Then once I started my actual job, then also at the same time was just spending free time looking into Bitcoin. And at a point in time, it kind of flipped where I was spending more time learning about Bitcoin than I was with my actual job, because there's a concept in consulting called being on the bench, where essentially you're not placed on a project. You're still getting paid, but you haven't been placed on a project. And for me, my time on the bench in 2017 was a good little while. It got to the point for me where I just spent that time getting paid and learning about Bitcoin and then investing. And I also fell down the quote unquote crypto rabbit hole, which, I since just Bitcoin only. I don't really deal in crypto. But at the time, I proverbially touched the stove and learned that lesson. But yeah, a lot of 2017 was kind of spent learning the technical about Bitcoin and then kind of just dabbling in everything going on. So that's kind of the path since college.
Yeah. So it sounds like a series of events aligned in such a way that it created an opportunity for you to really be able to deep dive on Bitcoin right at a period where, like you said, it was kind of emerging as something that people were talking about. So maybe you can just give us kind of a brief timeline for people who might not be familiar with Bitcoin inception, Bitcoin in 2016 when you were getting involved in it. And maybe even just for the layman person who's listening, it's something that everybody's probably heard of now, but they may not really know what it is. So how would you describe what Bitcoin is? And then kind of the timeline of, like I said, when Bitcoin came to be versus when you started to learn about it. Let's start with that.
Okay, so I think the best way to describe a tool or solution is to describe the problem first. So, and this problem is laid out in the white paper, but essentially the problem that Bitcoin tries to solve is that the way that what most people consider money works today, some people will call money currency, but either way, most people think of money as the paper in their pocket or the digital numbers in their bank account, right? And essentially the problem with that is that it requires trust. And basically, power corrupts, and that trust is always broken in terms of humans' relationship to money. Like if humans can find a way to benefit themselves by corrupting a money system, they will. All the way back to the gold standard, even before the gold standard, right? Like people could counterfeit money, they would. And, that's continued to today. So with Bitcoin, like the idea is to create a form of money that is very highly resistant to being corrupted, right? Much more highly resistant than the system today. So that's kind of why Bitcoin is created. But Bitcoin itself is a digital or internet native form of money, right? Is how I would describe it. And how it works, it takes a little more time to really kind of explain. But essentially, it removes the need to trust like a central authority and replaces that with computer code. And it's like a distributed system of computers that holistically hold each other accountable, right? It's kind of like if you can imagine, the best way I can describe Bitcoin is like a Mexican standoff of money, where essentially every participant in Bitcoin that chooses to be a full participant is able to hold every other participant accountable to the rules. Some people kind of say Bitcoin is a system of rules and not rulers. But how, like the timeline of Bitcoin, so the white paper was released on Halloween in 2008. So there was this mailing list, like an email list, where basically you just subscribe. So it's kind of like, you imagine like a newsletter almost, but like back in, I think it first started back in the 90s, right? But essentially it was just like a forum for people to share ideas via email, an email thread chain, essentially. And it was called the cypherpunk list. The cypherpunks basically were a group of individuals that wanted to explore how you could use encryption and other digital techniques to remove some power from the government, right? Like essentially the ethos of Bitcoin from the beginning, the ultimate goal is to remove money from state, right? So way back when Martin Luther penned his proclamation, and that was like the beginning of the removal of church and state, right? So Bitcoin for me is like the removal of money in state. So we take the role of money out of the hands of the government is essentially, in my mind, the end goal of Bitcoin personally. With the cyberpunks, like I said at the time, they were trying to figure out ways to use available tools to remove some of the authority and thus undue force that the government can exert, or, as a body, as a whole, right? Like not necessarily just individuals, but just as a whole, just removing some of the power that is unfairly wielded against a population, right? And Satoshi Nakamoto is the creator of Bitcoin, and nobody really knows if they're one person, a group of people, male, female. Nobody knows, like, nationality or anything. They were able to stay anonymous pretty much this whole time since Bitcoin's been created. But they released the Bitcoin white paper 3 months later on, I think, the 3rd of January, 2009. They released like a reference client. So like they released like the first version of Bitcoin. And pretty much since then, Bitcoin is what's called an open source software project or software system. So all of the code is available, and anybody that is able to contribute, understand the code, there are channels that you would go through, but anybody is able to understand the code can contribute to Bitcoin, or they can take the code and they can kind of what they call fork it, which kind of you take the code and then you can add something yourself and kind of like, run that forked version of Bitcoin. And so that's kind of available to people. But I would say like that's kind of like the timeline of Bitcoin's inception to today. And like I said, I kind of just fell into it like in 2015, 2016. I didn't like know anybody at that point in time that I was learning about Bitcoin from. So it was like largely me learning via the internet.
Wow. Yeah. So it sounds like you were like one of like the early people to get involved with Bitcoin. So like you said, 1031 of 2008, and not even 8 years later, you're reading this white paper, deep diving, and said to the point where, you're at your regular job and you're like, oh, thank goodness I'm not on the case right now. I can do more research about Bitcoin, but this is still pretty early. It's not even 10 years old at this point. So you were one of the early adopters to learning about this and kind of, like you said, deep diving into the subject. Did you end up quitting the job that you were at and like saying like, I have to learn more about Bitcoin? Or did you take some other kind of path before Bitcoin became a bigger part of your life?
Yeah, no, so I didn't leave the job. I got fired just because, like I said, it got to the point I was just on the bench. Like, I wasn't trying to get myself placed on a project. They weren't placing me on a project. And at the beginning of 2017 was at $1,000. At the end of 2017, it briefly hit $20,000. While I was at PwC, the majority of the time, it wasn't anywhere close to 20K. But it basically, not only was it more interesting, but also was seeing some money, at least on paper at the time, just learning about Bitcoin and, like I said, crypto before I kind of decided that's a dead end road. I got fired. But to be honest with you, though, sometimes, I wonder if there was like more to the situation. Like, I guess one issue was I asked to be in Houston, but to a lot of different industries that PwC consults for. So I was consulting for the banking industry. So there's no big banks or anything in Houston. So it kind of makes it hard to network to be placed on like a team. And I guess for whatever reason, HR wasn't placing me. So that definitely I think was a contributor. But also at the time, my grandfather was on the board of a bank that PwC was an auditor for back in like around the 2008 financial crisis. And long story short, the bank got in trouble for their audit. I wonder at times, based on my last name, if there was like some association there was like a legal case that was going on essentially that involved my grandfather and PwC via the connection of this bank that he was a board member of at that point in time. So like nobody expressly said that. And I'm not saying that is the case. Like obviously, like I said, I was on the bench for a while and I really wasn't trying to get off the bench. So it might have just been they weren't doing their job to place me somewhere. And, I wasn't really doing my job trying to get placed. But either way, yeah, I'm getting fired.
So let's talk a little bit about like what your overall financial situation was in that case. So we haven't talked a lot about like you finished school, you went off for 5 months, you were doing the teaching, you got placed at PwC, you got really excited about Bitcoin, and now you're fired. Like, what did you know about organizing your finances beyond the basics at the point at which you got your first job at PwC, or maybe even from the time that you finished college and from the gap year until this point where you like still saving as much as you can? You mentioned being a saver when you were a kid. There's a 401k at work. Did you like know and understand that thing where you're trying to like put your money there and then you got involved in Bitcoin? Like, what were you thinking kind of from a personal finance standpoint about how you were setting yourself up as you were just at the beginning of your overall career and the beginning of adulting in general, I would say?
Yeah. So I would say that at the point I started my job at PwC, at that point I already built up like pretty good credit. I understood the credit scoring system at that point. So because I found Bitcoin and I learned enough, like I kind of jumped into that head first. So back then I would consider more investing in Bitcoin, but now I kind of consider it saving in Bitcoin. And for me, I save in Bitcoin to this day. Like majority of my net worth, just is in Bitcoin, both because I put excess savings in it, but also because of appreciation. At that time too, like, I was investing in it. And for me, I like when I first got into it versus like, by the time I started like getting in my career, making more money, it had already appreciated somewhat, but ideologically primed and aligned with Bitcoin. So by the time I started my job, I wasn't very interested in 401k. Contributed much more than what my company would contribute. So I want to say at the time, like they placed so much in it, maybe, or like, I know they definitely like placed money into the health savings account, but like I said, I really wouldn't, I didn't really care to put money to 401k. And, that it just never really was an interest after finding Bitcoin. Because based on my knowledge of kind of credit, like I was able to, at the time, like, they take advantage of credit cards and credit limits with 0% interest. In the beginning of 2017, I took out a loan in the form of a credit card with 12% zero interest. And my idea being that with my salary, I could pay off the loan, right? And I took that money and I invested it. And, over the course of 2017, I did really well on paper. So for me, it was the first taste of what appreciation can do for you, right? And kind of like the concept of concentration is how you make wealth, and diversification is how you keep it, right? And at the time I didn't know it as that concept, but I kind of was just, I guess, thrown into how appreciation works via experiencing it. So for me, like, I found Bitcoin at a time in my life where I had money put into it and started my career. And pretty much since then, I have just seen Bitcoin as a path forward in my life and in relation to savings. And I see it as a much more transparent and, I guess, fair system to the stock market, even though there are certain stocks that, I've obviously seen catapult and, at times look like, damn, like, had I known what I know now, I would have put some money in this to flip it and then put it back into Bitcoin. But at the same time, like, that's what hindsight allows you, is the full knowledge of the situation. But for me, like, fundamentally, I kind of just see the stock market generally as much more opaque and rigged to big players than I see Bitcoin. So for me, it's like, I use credit to be able to put money into Bitcoin, and over the course of 2017 into 2018, rode the wave up, and then in 2018 into 2019, rode it back down. Because if you're familiar, at the time, like, there was a big jump in the price of Bitcoin and other quote unquote cryptos from 2017 to 2018. Like, into 2018 to 2019, kind of with the crash, going from being euphoric to, like, despair or whatever is on the Wall Street. It's like a chart, Wall Street psychology chart. Basically, just like whenever prices go parabolic of the emotions you experience, goes on there. But after experiencing the crash, it kind of made me dig even deeper into Bitcoin, and like, I became more aligned with Bitcoin, and also differentiated Bitcoin from everything else.
So let's talk a little bit about risk tolerance. So you mentioned like Bitcoin being around 1,000 at some point when you knew about it and maybe started to participate. I'm looking at a chart here and I see, like, in 2018, it was around $6,000, and it kind of goes up here or there. We get up to 10 grand in 2019, and then it kind of gets real crazy. Obviously, 2020 was a little bit weird time. It stayed around 10, but at its height, it looks like it hit around 60 grand in 2021. And today we're down to around 25,000. So for people who kind of rode the wave, to your point, in terms of like traditional investing, like, Bitcoin's way too speculative. Like you said, it's not even 20 years old at this point. But it sounds like maybe you did ride the wave, or did you kind of bail out at some point? No matter where you got in, somewhere in 2018, if you threw $1,000 in, your $1,000 is $25,000 today for, that one coin, quote unquote, if you will. So talk a little bit about your risk tolerance. And like you said, you felt all these different emotions, but was there times that you bailed out, or what were you thinking?
I would say that risk tolerance wise, pretty much since I dove deep into Bitcoin, I've just been aligned with it. And for me, I see Bitcoin on a long time scale to be less risky than government bonds, less risky than real estate, less risky than stocks. All these things have an apparatus or like a pinch point, essentially, right? Like, you have to own stocks to a broker, right? But your broker could cut you off from your earnings at the behest of the government. If you buy government bonds, you're buying directly from the government. And then with real estate, you can own it nominally, but if you don't pay property taxes, they'll take it from you. Or through eminent domain, they'll take it from you. Whereas with Bitcoin and digital currencies that are protected via encryption, you could sooner kill me than you could take it from me if I decided to die for it, right? And I'm not advocating dying for it. I'm not saying that is the path that I am wedded to. But the point being is that the dynamic is different. With anything that's physical or anything that has a pinch point that's allowed by the system, it can be taken by the system, right? So if I have gold physically hidden and you find out where it's hidden and you kill me, you can take the gold. Whereas if I have Bitcoin that's hidden and you kill me and I'm the only person that knows how to access the Bitcoin, then that Bitcoin just dies with me. That Bitcoin now is inaccessible for the rest of time. For me, that changes the dynamic of what's called the returns to violence, right? So essentially, at the end of the day, like, there's actually an example of this in Germany. There was a guy that got placed in jail. I don't remember what he got caught doing, but he got caught and the authorities knew he had Bitcoin. But essentially, he got placed in jail and he never gave it the Bitcoin, and he just did his whole sentence. And once he got out, the Bitcoin is still his, right? Whereas if he had stocks or real estate or something physical that they could abduct, then it would be gone. So for me, risk tolerance wise, I see holding other things more risky than holding Bitcoin. So the price volatility is a second derivative risk for me. But when in terms of like the price going up and down, like I said, at the time I was dabbling in cryptos. So there were cryptos that I rolled up and rolled down, kind of similar to how I think about it now, where it's like, I'm in it for the long haul. So I'm going to ride these price waves. When you're talking about traditional investing, we can speak of value investing. That's essentially formulate a thesis on why you think something is valuable or undervalued by the market, and you wait for the market to catch up, right? So with Amazon, like, with the 2001 tech boom and bust, a number of companies that survived to today were a part of that. And like some of them had like 90% drawdowns, including Amazon. Obviously, if you had sold Amazon before it crashed and then bought it at the bottom, you would do well. But timing these things is basically impossible. So some people say that it's better to have time in the market than timing the market, which basically means just stay put because you don't know what direction it's going to go. And even if it goes down, as long as your thesis is right, over time, it'll pay off. So for me, I feel like I had the correct thesis in relation to Bitcoin, and I was applying that thesis to cryptos, and that was the wrong thing. So for me, I now see crypto, like being in crypto and holding cryptos as gambling, whereas I see Bitcoin as saving. So I was applying my thought process of saving to forms of assets or, whatever you want to call them, that now I think of as gambling. But essentially, in terms of either being in Bitcoin or cryptos, pretty much from the jump, I've been in either or. It got from a point where I held Bitcoin and other things to now I only hold Bitcoin. But yeah, I never really jumped ship to get back into dollars to buy more Bitcoin because of, like I said, especially with Bitcoin, like Bitcoin is an asset that has worldwide markets and trades 24/7 and moves very quickly. I pretty much from the jump learned that timing the market is something I'm not very good at and is not very easy for majority of people. And even people who are good at it, it's hard to do consistently. So I didn't have risk tolerance to price as much as I had a risk tolerance to holding and protecting what I believe over time the market will come to value at a much higher price.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have an investment thesis and an understanding of saying like, hey, this is my idea. This is what I believe. And I am going to ride the wave based on this belief. And just being firm in your understanding of whatever it is that you decide to invest in. Maybe as we wrap up, you can kind of give us a round out of where you are now and what you're thinking about your financial future and how you're kind of organizing yourself to prepare for the goals and aspirations that you have for your financial future.
I think right now is a really weird time, just in general, in terms of like this financial monetary policy, I mean specifically. And to give a backdrop, interest rates, which is think of like the price of money, right? Like how much you can borrow money for, how much money they'll charge you to borrow money is what interest rate is. And pretty much the people who set the interest rates for the whole world, and they do it in a way that's derivative, but essentially the Federal Reserve sets the price of US dollars, and all other assets and interest rates are created based off of that, because essentially there's an idea that US bonds are quote unquote risk free. There's no thought that the US government will default on that promise to pay. So interest rates have been raised by the Federal Reserve in a short amount of time in history. Essentially right now, like rates went from close to zero to close to 5% on the rate that they set in like less than a year. And all of this led to just a lot of discombobulations in financial markets, because some of these risk-free government bonds now are worth less, because if you bought a bond a year ago or 2 years ago that yielded 1%, and now you can buy a bond that yields 5%, basically your bond is now worth less. And on top of the fact that on the other side, on the government side, government is printing a lot of money and giving it directly to people, and that's causing inflation. So for me, I kind of just see my path forward as trying to protect what I have and survive. And like I said, for me, that's staying in Bitcoin. So like the price of Bitcoin can drop, but that's the US dollar price. But the amount of Bitcoin I own is the same. With the backdrop of the financial uncertainties happening in the world and the government printing money and all of the dislocations that these policies create, I just think personally, having hard assets that are outside of the system is kind of my path forward. Everything I do financially is kind of within that lens. But because of the fact that I kind of believe that due to what's happening, the government's going to have to print more money to kind of backfill some of the decisions they're making now. I believe that holding assets that are scarce and that are not as easy manipulative will pay off in the long run. Right now, kind of just trying to stay solvent and just try to figure out ways in which I can use my credit that I have, my creditworthiness, to get money. And I've been looking recently into trying to maybe buy cash flowing businesses, where instead of starting a business, you can just buy a business from somebody that, for whatever reason, wants to sell. And as long as they have maybe like a 5-year track record or more of being profitable, if you can get enough money to buy the business, you can have an income stream. So I'm kind of just at a point where I want to use credit to bolster my income and save in hard assets, which, for me are assets outside of the system that I think can and will be devalued to keep the ball rolling. So that's kind of my thesis to round out, is saving hard assets. And even though it's boring, like sometimes you just have to pay attention to the decisions the people at the top make, because it 100% affects you in ways that aren't fair and you wouldn't really understand if you didn't take the time to learn. So financial education, not in the sense of what is mainstream, but more in the sense of how the monetary system works, I think is very important. It's something that I focus on personally.
This has been super duper informative. I've learned so much from just listening to you today. Bitcoin is not my area of expertise. I'm not well versed in it, but you have shared a lot of different things that help us better understand the world of not cryptocurrency in general, but Bitcoin specifically. Maybe just as we wrap up, you could tell people where we can find you if someone's really interested and wants to talk more about this, how we can support you. Is there anything that someone in our community or the listeners can do to kind of help you along your path?
Yes, I'm not really big on social media like that, but I am on Twitter. If you want to find me, my handle is Stakamoto21, so STAKAMOTO 21. You can reach out there, but otherwise, yeah, that's pretty much where you'll find me. And support-wise, you don't really have to support me, but I would just recommend, if you don't know about Bitcoin, just start learning. And if you have somebody around you, ask them. But otherwise, Twitter is actually a really good resource to learn about Bitcoin. So, I would definitely just educate yourself on Bitcoin and, just like I said, the monetary system as a whole, because it's not set up to help you win. And the only way you can really learn to win is to learn the ways in which it's set up against you.
Sean, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really, really appreciate you coming and sharing your perspective on Bitcoin. The listeners are so much more educated, and I'm sure this will probably be the first of many. I'd love to have you back on the show sometime in the future.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you for inviting me on. For the listeners, sorry if I kind of ramble a little bit at times. I'm kind of new to the podcasting to an extent, but I appreciate the opportunity. My DMs are open on Twitter. Thank you for listening, and thank you for having me.